Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on executing, monitoring, and controlling resources. Part 1. This lesson comes in 4 parts, following the 4 processes of executing, monitoring, and controlling resources. Acquire resources, develop team, manage team, and control resources. And then at the end, we also have a quiz. The resource management knowledge area includes 2 processes in the planning process group: plan resource management and estimate activity resources, which we've already covered. Next, we have the executing process group, which includes acquire resources, develop team, and manage team. And then the monitoring and controlling process group, which includes just control resources. The primary outputs of acquire resources are physical resource assignments, team resource assignments, and resource calendars. The develop team process has as its primary output team performance assessments. Manage team doesn't really have an artifact as an output, but control resources has as its primary output work performance information. We start with the acquire resources process. And I'd like to start by being clear about the scope of this process. This is where internal resources are acquired and assigned, including both people and physical resources. But it does not include external resources, because those are acquired through procurement processes. In order to acquire the resources you need, you're going to have to negotiate with those who can provide these resources. This can be complicated by being in a matrix organization in which you need to negotiate with functional managers and department heads and others who control these resources. You may need to negotiate with unions, or your project management office, or other project managers who are competing for scarce resources, or with individual team members themselves who have the autonomy to choose what they work on. But getting the right resources is critical to your project success, and not getting the right resources can affect your project in many ways, including affecting your project schedule, its costs, quality, risks, the satisfaction of your stakeholders, and in extreme cases could even result in your project being canceled if you simply can't get the resources you need. You may need to look for alternative resources and live with different competency levels or different costs or different requirements, and make adjustments to your project accordingly. If you find that you can't get the resources you wanted or needed, you'll need to make sure you communicate the impact of these effects to your stakeholders. The inputs to the acquire resources process, starting with the most relevant, are the resource requirements, which specifies what resources you're going to need for the project, as well as, surprisingly, the stakeholder register, because this may include some specific resources that stakeholders have requested to be on the project. Your resource calendars are what show when you need different resources on the project. The project schedule shows specifics for start and end dates of activities. Your cost baseline shows the budget that you have, including your budget for resources, and this might have to be adjusted perhaps based on not being able to find the resources you needed. Your resource management plan, of course, because it has the rules specifying how you should acquire resources. Your procurement management plan, only because you may need to coordinate your efforts with procurement. And some enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Information about resource availability, the different competency levels of these resources, the experience that they have within your organization or other organizations on similar projects, as well as what it costs for these resources, are all part of the enterprise environmental factors that can influence your process of acquiring resources, as are marketplace conditions if you're looking to acquire resources and hire them onto your team, your organizational structure, which can affect how you need to work within your organization to acquire resources, and also the geographical locations that may be involved where resources may be located or where you need to do work. Organizational process assets include your HR policies for how you should be acquiring resources, especially if you're bringing them in from outside, how they should be allocated and assigned. And also lessons learned in your lessons learned repository that includes historical information about acquiring resources on previous projects. Deciding which resources to acquire for your project can be a complex process. You won't usually find just the right resources available at just the right times and at the right price. To help you make these decisions, you can use multi-criteria decision analysis. You determine which criteria are important, prioritize these criteria, apply different percentages or weights to each criteria, and use a weighted average to calculate an overall score for each resource, which you can then use to rank order them and acquire the ones at the top of the list. A spreadsheet is a useful tool for doing this analysis. Selection criteria that you could use for all types of resources, both physical resources and people, include the ability of the resource to do the work, the capacity or productivity of the resource, that is, how much the resource can produce in a given amount of time, to what degree the resource is available when you need it. Some resources may be available most of the time, and you may be able to modify your schedule a bit to accommodate needed resources. And the cost of the resource. Selection criteria that apply specifically to people include the amount and level of relevant experience, the degree to which they have the needed knowledge and skills, their attitude about the project, how well they work with others and their personality traits, where they're located, because it can be a challenge to have a distributed team, especially across distant time zones, and the communication skills, including writing, speaking, and understanding in the language that will be used by the project team. Next on the list of tools and techniques is interpersonal and team skills, in particular skills such as negotiation, which you'll need to use in negotiating with others for the scarce resources that you need for your project, including functional managers, especially in matrix organizations, and traditional hierarchical organizations in which functional managers are in charge of and manage the resources, physical and people, that you need. You'll also need to negotiate with individual team members, especially as those team members have greater autonomy in deciding where they want to work. Other project managers who have certain resources for their projects or need them for their projects, you may need to coordinate your efforts with them. The PMO, if you have a strong PMO, may be in a position to control or influence the allocation of resources. If you have unions involved with collective bargaining agreements, you'll need to work with them and within the terms of those agreements. And you may also have already existing relationships with external suppliers that you can work with. It also helps to have a network of friends and acquaintances that you can draw upon when you need resources. On one project that I was planning for a large long-term project in Outer Mongolia, we discovered that we needed a document management expert to be on site for a while. I happened to have been working with and known some of the top experts in the organization in document management, and one of them was a friend of mine from back home. So I called him up, we talked about it, and he was open to the idea, but then we needed to escalate as well to my upper management and his upper management in order to arrange for him to be there for several months in order to help plan and implement this project. In another case, in working on a large project for a university, there were several subject matter experts scattered across multiple departments within the university. And so I needed to escalate up to the group of VPs in charge and get them all to agree to make all of these subject matter experts available when we needed them on the project, which also required that I put together a plan that detailed how many hours we would need each week from each of these subject matter experts. In another simpler case, we needed a visual designer for a few hours a week to help us with a small application that we were developing for a smartphone. And I just needed to escalate this need to my practice manager, who was able to find us a suitable person that performed very well in the project. As you negotiate for the resources you need, you may want to review the different types of power or influence that you and others have in this negotiation, and how you can influence appropriately, and which types of influence you should use in different situations. Positional power or influence is formal or legitimate power that you get from your position within the organizational structure. Informational power is power that you have because of the information you have and control, and how you control the gathering and distribution of this information. Referent power or influence is the respect or admiration that you have because of the credibility that you've gained within the organization. Situational power or influence is more specifically about a unique situation in which you happen to be in the right place at the right time to be of help. Personal or charismatic power is more about your personality and the personal charm or attraction that you have. Relational power or influence is more to do with the power and influence you have as a result of networking and the connections that you have to different people, especially people who have power and influence to help you with resource negotiation. Expert power is about you being an expert. It's the skills and information and experience and training and everything that you have that makes you an expert in some field, that gives you some power or influence in a situation. In your position, you may have the authority to also reward people or punish people or coerce people into doing things. So reward-oriented power influence is your ability to reward people with money or other things or perks, but also as simple as giving praise to people. Punitive or coercive power influence is your ability to discipline them or in some way to bring negative consequences to bear. Ingratiating influence is when you're seeking common ground with someone in order to try and get their cooperation, and can include both positive and negative forms of doing this. It could be seeking common ground in a positive way or using simple flattery. Pressure-based power influence is when you have the ability to somehow limit someone's choices or freedom, especially in their job environment, and that you can use this to try and get them to provide or do what you want them to do. Guilt-based power influence is when you guilt someone into doing something, often by appealing to their sense of duty or obligation. Persuasive is more about your ability to provide rational arguments to help people see that a certain way of doing things is the right thing to do, or that certain resources, it makes more sense to have those resources on your project, and so on. Avoiding is an interesting one in which people can exert their power or influence by refusing to participate in some way, such as not attending meetings that are important meetings for the project. Some resources may already be pre-assigned to your project, either because it was part of an agreement during a procurement process to have specific resources assigned, or because early on you identified that there was some particular expertise within the organization from someone or from specific resources that were necessary, and those would have been spelled out in the project charter. Virtual teams are becoming more and more common as we have tools such as email and chat and conference calls and webinars and things like that we can use to connect virtual teams. There are specific software applications that are available now that are specifically targeted at allowing teams, including remote and virtual teams, to communicate with each other very rapidly. This can allow you to bring in technical or industry experts that you might not otherwise have available to you, to allow them to participate more fully and actively in a team. You may have subject matter experts or users that are remote that you want to involve in your team, and you can use these tools to involve them more than ever before. Different time zones can be a challenge, and you may need to schedule some of your meetings and collaboration for those time zones that are overlapping, and hopefully you at least have some overlap in time zones, or perhaps you can modify some of the working schedules and shifts of your team in order to improve the overlap. I had one case in which we had teams from the United States and Australia collaborating, and they only had about 1 hour of overlap. And so we changed the working schedule of our team in the US so that they worked longer days and only worked 4 days a week. This allowed for 2 or 3 hours worth of overlap in our evenings, which was much more productive, and it gave the team in the US their Fridays off, which they thoroughly enjoyed. As a result of pulling together these resources into virtual teams, you can end up with better teamwork, and you can definitely reduce your travel costs by not having to fly or transport people around. However, you have to always bear in mind that communication within virtual teams is always a challenge and requires a lot more work, and probably more work than you realize, because it's a lot harder to keep tabs on how well the communications and relationships are going when you have such distributed virtual teams. When you've finished the acquire resources process, the outputs that you're after here are that you now have physical resources and project team members assigned to your project. You should also have resource calendars that indicate when your resources are available, and you'll update your resource breakdown structure and resource requirements documents to reflect the resources that you've been able to acquire. If you've needed to change some things, such as your project schedule or costs or even your resource management plan based on the specific resources you were able to find, then you'll need to make changes to these. And if these have been baselined, then you'll need to issue change requests in order to do this and go through the Perform Integrated Change Control process. Also, any lessons learned need to be recorded in your register, as well as any new risks or updates to risks, and perhaps information or new information about stakeholders. Your enterprise environmental factors may be updated specifically around the resources availability. Now that you have allocated some resources, that changes the resource availability for the rest of the organization. And some of what you've done may affect some of the policies and guidelines that you have as part of your organizational process assets. How much do you remember of the inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques of the acquire resources process? The main outputs are assignments for physical resources and project team members, including resource calendars with details of when these resources are available. And some secondary outputs include change requests that may be needed to update documents such as your cost baseline and your project schedule, and other project documents such as your resource breakdown structure and resource requirements that will be updated. Also, risk register, stakeholder register, and other secondary outputs. The main inputs to this process are your resource requirements, combined with resource calendars and your project schedule, so that you can see which resources may line up with your needs. And you'll need to do this following the rules of your resource management plan and in coordination with your procurement management plan. And to make some of these difficult decisions, you may want to use tools and techniques such as multi-criteria decision analysis. You'll certainly need negotiation skills. Some resources may be pre-assigned, and virtual teams can be used for your project.
This is the end of Part 1.
PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.